Thank you very much for that introduction. So good to see everybody, and I appreciate this opportunity to share a bit about Norwegian migration to Canada in the early 19th in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an area that is often overlooked and it's not as thoroughly studied and generally less well known than Norwegian migration to the United States. I myself moved to Canada from the States over 30 years ago to teach Norwegian and Scandinavian studies at what was then Augustana University College, formerly Camrose Lutheran College, and now the Augustana faculty of the University of Alberta. And we're the only university campus in Canada with Norwegian roots. The Augustana campus is an undergraduate liberal arts campus of the U of A, and we're located in 100 kilometers from Edmonton in Camrose, and we have 1,000 students. The place where I live and teach is located at Assiniskawassapesis, Stony Creek in Treaty 6 territory. This territory provided a traveling route and home to the Musqueam, Nahiawak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis, and other indigenous peoples. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning at the University of Alberta and our life as a community. A visual reminder of Augustana's location on Indigenous land is the Treaty Bear, positioned centrally on our campus in the Quad. It was created by Stuart Steinhauser of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. And I'd like to share a poem written by a former Augustana student, Naomi McElwright, which appears in her Plains Cree and English poetry collection, Kiam, or Let It Be, published by Athabasca University Press in 2012. And her poem is very brief, and it's called An Instruction for Canadian History. Be quiet for a minute. Wait now. You might hear something in the silence. So I'm going to bookend my presentation with images and stories, and here is the opening image. I would like to thank my colleague Kari Lidor, you all know who she is now, a professor of Norwegian here at St. Olaf College. I'd like to thank her for sharing it and the story behind it with me. You will see 3 young boys here, each holding the flag of the country in which they were born. The oldest boy, Hans Lee, as you can see there, is holding a Norwegian flag, since he was born in Telemark in 1912. Hans and his parents emigrated to the US in 1914, and the middle boy, Leif Lee, was born in Fisher, Minnesota in 1915, so he is holding an American flag. The family moved to Canada in 1918, and the youngest boy, Dagfinn Lee, Kari Lee's grandfather, was born in Dutchess, Alberta in 1920. And here he is holding what appears to be the red ensign with the Union Jack in the upper left corner. The family came back to the US in 1924 to Hoopla, North Dakota, and then to Fisher, Minnesota. I should say Hoople, North Dakota. I should pronounce that as it's pronounced, and then to Fisher, Minnesota. This picture is a fitting representation of the many Norwegians who cross national borders multiple times in their lives, not least the border between the US and Canada, and it is a reminder of the fact that migrants have and had complicated and multifaceted identities. As I said, today I will discuss Norwegian migration to Canada in the 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on how the intracontinental movement of people, ideas, and institutions played a significant role in this migration and the scholarship surrounding it. This approach fits in nicely with the theme Crossings and Connections, since there were so many Norwegian migrants that crossed the border between the US and Canada, often multiple times, and I've just given you an example of that. As a result of this cross-border movement, Norwegian migrants in Canada and the US were connected in myriad ways through the Lutheran churches, the immigrant press, educational institutions, ethnic organizations such as the Bygdelag and the Sons of Norway, and not least through familial connections. Since most of the Norwegian migrants during the period I'm looking at ended up in the Prairie Provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, as well as in British Columbia, I will give the Alberta context a fair bit of attention. My purpose today is not only to highlight an often overlooked dimension of Norwegian migration to North America, but also to raise awareness of primary and secondary sources and themes for further study. And there are several scholars. I'm not a historian, I work with literature, but I work a bit with history, but we do have historians here who work with Canada, who have done or are doing work in the field, and one of them, Professor Odd Lovoll, has done extensive work. Gunnar Nærheim is also here, and he's currently working with the Prairie Provinces. Darren Olsen is also engaged with some Canadian work. Though there is arguably a dearth of published research in this area, there are plenty of materials available for study. So my hope is that my talk will stimulate further interest in Norwegian migration to Canada as a research area. And finally, I will point out the role interdisciplinary scholarship, historical fiction, and visual arts have played and continue to play in raising awareness of the Norwegian-Canadian experience. As I look at some of the broad strokes of Norwegian migration to Canada, I will illustrate them with the stories of individual people and communities. As the American feminist poet and activist Muriel Rukeyser once said, quote, "The universe is made of stories, not atoms." Or not of atoms, we should say. So when we look at trends of migration, it's important to remember that there are faces behind the statistics. I do want to make a comment here. I'm projecting a map, as you can see, of Canada. I'm not showing historical maps. I'm showing contemporary maps, but just so you get a sense of the provinces and the areas I'm talking about. I'm going to start my talk today with something called the Viking frame, and I'll get to that in a moment. Then I'll start in with the Quebec chapter. Next section, from the Midwest to the prairies, the Minnesota Norwegians. A bit about areas for further study, and my final thoughts. Okay, the Viking frame. So before I turn to Norwegian migration to Canada in modern times, it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention the Viking frame that has frequently been employed by scholars to introduce this topic. For example, in Gulbrand Loken's A History of the Norwegians in Canada, published in 1988, and still the only book-length survey on the topic of Norwegian migration to Canada, the excavation of the Viking site in Lonesome Meadows on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland figures prominently into the first chapter, called Early Transient Migration. This site is now both a National Historic Site and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Has anybody been there to Lonesome Meadows in the group, I'm assuming? Yes, great. Odd Lovoll's 2015 study, Across the Deep Blue Sea, which examines the movement of Norwegians through Canadian port cities in the 1850s to early 70s, uses the phrase a Viking footprint, while mentioning the travels of Leif Erikson and his brother Thorvald to North America as portrayed in the Icelandic sagas, pointing out that Leif Erikson has been identified by Canadian historians as, quote, the first historically named individual in Canadian history. A third example is a local history of the Norwegian settlement in Bardo, Alberta, published by amateur historians Ragna Stan and Magda Hendrickson in 1944. The authors asked Norwegian-American author, journalist, and editor N.N. Ronning to write a brief introduction, and in it he weaves references to the Norwegians' discovery of America into his comments on the long seafaring traditions in Norway. Discussions surrounding Viking activities in North America are complex, particularly when one examines the intersection between whiteness, indigeneity, and modern interpretations of and portrayals of these voyages and attempts to settle. My point today isn't to engage with those intersections, but rather to note the way in which scholars and others draw parallels between the movements of people in the Viking Age with Norwegians in more modern times. And Viking Age journeys to North America have captured the imaginations of the public, as we know, in Canada, the US, and Norway alike. So let's start with the Quebec chapter. And of course, before 1867, that was a confederation. Quebec was a separate British province, Ontario, and so on. It was in 1867, July 1st, that Confederation occurred. So let's start with the Quebec chapter. The story of the sloop Restoration and its passengers is well known and has been told many times. The impetus for Crossings 200 and this Crossings and Connections Conference, as we know, was the 200th anniversary of the Restoration's journey from Stavanger to New York in 1825. Not as many people are familiar with the Lena, the ship Lena, which arrived in Quebec in 1850. According to Quebec's chief immigration agent, A.C. Buchanan, this was the first time a Norwegian ship with passengers landed there. The Lena was but one Norwegian ship that arrived in Quebec with passengers that year. 244 arrived in all, and the numbers rapidly increased in the years that followed. Canadian ports, Quebec, Montreal, and others replaced New York as the gateway for Norwegian migrants to North America from 1850 until the late 1860s. During that period, over 94% of Norwegian migrants arrived in Canada. There were several reasons for this situation, including the relaxing of restrictive trade measures by the British, the relaxing of those restrictions allowed Norwegian ships to carry Canadian timber to the British Isles for trade. Rather than carry ballast on the way to Canada, some ship owners chose to transport Norwegian migrants. By carrying cargo both to and from North America, they were able to offer lower prices for passengers than ships sailing to New York. The Canadian route was also shorter for those wanting to move to the American upper Midwest to join family and friends. And the St. Lawrence Passageway, its rivers and lakes and canals, was a somewhat sheltered route. Both Norwegian ship owners and captains, as well as Canadian authorities and immigration agents, played a role in promoting Norway-Canada travel and this route among Norwegians. American Railroad, state and land agents encouraged the migrants to settle in places like Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota once they arrived, successfully competing with Canadian efforts to encourage Norwegians to settle in colonies in Quebec. By 1874, the year in which the last sailing ship carried Norwegian migrants to North America, around 115,000 Norwegian passengers had landed in the port of Quebec. Lovoll points out these numbers only represent those who arrived directly to Quebec from a Norwegian port, not the smaller number of Norwegian migrants who arrived in Montreal, Gaspé, St. John, New Brunswick, and Halifax, Nova Scotia. In the early 1870s, New York gradually replaced Quebec once again as the primary destination for Norwegian newcomers to North America. And of course, steamships had taken over passenger traffic at that time. What is significant for our look at intracontinental connections today is that in addition to the Norwegian migrants who rapidly moved on to the American upper Midwest, some with the assistance of the Canadian government, some with support from relatives in the United States, the majority of those who initially stayed in Quebec in the organized settlements of Bury and Gaspé also eventually moved to Wisconsin and Minnesota by steamship and train. This Quebec chapter, including the stories of the failed Gaspé settlement, are deftly and thoroughly discussed in Lovoll's Across the Deep Blue Sea, and my comments have been informed by the work Lovoll has done. Maybe I should just, this is a very difficult, can you see? Yeah, I don't have a pointer, but here you have, of course, Quebec, Montreal, and here's Sherbrooke, and that Bury settlement area is around there. There are two published accounts of Norwegians in Quebec during these early years, and the first is Johan Schroeder's Travels in Canada, 1863, originally published in Norwegian in 1867, and then in English in 1989 as a scholarly edition that was edited, translated, and introduced by Orm Øverland. According to Øverland, this account of Canada, quote, is the only narrative of travel in the province of Canada by a Scandinavian, and one of the very few written by a traveler from outside the English-speaking world. The second account, My First Years in Canada, is a short piece by N.N. Brun, which appeared in Simra, a Norwegian language periodical, in 1911. Brun came with his parents to Gaspé in the 1860s and later became a Lutheran minister. Notably, both Schroeder and Brun only spent a short time in Canada, moving on to the American Midwest, as did so many others. Brun closes his account with a reflection on ill timing. Quote, "The last I heard from our old neighbors, all Norwegians had left. I am told that Gaspé is now an important city with considerable trade and lumber industry. The forests have been cleared for many miles, and the population is progressive and prosperous. It was our misfortune that we came a little too early." However, though most of the Norwegian migrants moved on to the States during this period, some stayed. And here is a photo of the grave of a woman, Sigrid Evensen, who was born in Norway in 1831 and died in the Bury area in 1905. My colleague Trygve Ugland, who teaches at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, recently sent me this photograph, which he took at a local cemetery. Evensen's gravestone is a visual reminder that there are stories still to be uncovered. Okay, let's get to the Minnesota Norwegians. It was not until the turn of the 20th century that Norwegians came in large numbers to Canada, when many of them moved from North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Montana to the Prairie Provinces. And I've already said what they are: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And people also moved into BC. Eric Foe's Norwegians in the Northwest provides an overview of Norwegian migrant activity in BC, and I won't be talking about that today, but it's a resource available for you. In the late 19th century, Norwegians in the States were pushed out of the upper Midwest by agricultural failure due to severe drought and economic depression. They chose the Prairie Provinces when land and economic opportunities opened up due to the Dominion Land Acts of 1872 and the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railroad in 1885. This sounds familiar, right, to folks in the Midwest? There are lots of parallels. Canadians of Norwegian descent are keenly aware of this movement, and the term Minnesota Norwegians is a colloquial term used on the Canadian prairies to describe the people involved in this movement across the border. Names of settlements such as New Norway and Bergen in Alberta, Hagensborg near Bella Coola in BC, and Ibsen in Saskatchewan reflect the Norwegian origins of their founders. To give a few additional examples of Norwegian names, and there are hundreds, Solheim, Hagen, and Idun were the names given to school districts in Saskatchewan. And we find churches such as Trondheim Lutheran Church in Round Hill, Alberta, right around the corner from where I live, St. Olaf Church in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. Those churches are still active today. Of the Of course, people emigrated directly to the Prairie Provinces from Norway as well. Between 1900 and 1914, 10% of Norwegian immigrants from Norway to North America ended up on the Prairie Provinces. And in the 1920s, when immigration policies became more restrictive in the US, this had risen to 24%. This meant that approximately 75 to 90% of Norwegian migrants came from the States during this period, something Loken calls, quote, an overflow of earlier settlement in the Midwest. It isn't surprising that the various synods of the Lutheran Church in the States supported the settlers with pastors and other types of aid in newly established Norwegian Canadian settlements. And 5 different Lutheran synods were organized in Canada: the Norwegian Synod, the Hauge Synod, the United Norwegian Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Free Church, and the Lutheran Brethren. I am not an expert on church history, but I'll throw that out there for those of you that are interested. Before 1941, all of the pastors in Norwegian Lutheran churches in Canada had received their training in seminaries in the States. But this changed after the establishment of the Lutheran College and Seminary at Saskatoon. A couple of decades after their arrival, the migrants started to identify their church as Canadian, or their churches as Canadian. And in 1917, 3 Norwegian church bodies in Canada merged to form the Norwegian Lutheran Church of Canada. Just as when Norwegians settled together in the United States, the establishment of churches were a top priority in Canada, and hundreds of congregations and preaching points were established in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. For example, in Saskatchewan, 224 congregations and 98 preaching points were established between 1903 and 1916. We're talking about, of course, a big geographical area, but not a lot of people. But that's significant, that number. The Saskatchewan situation has been thoroughly studied by Alan B. Anderson in Settling Saskatchewan in the chapter Nordic Settlements. So that's another resource that's available to folks. Clerical support from the US for Norwegians in Canada had existed previously. It's worth noting that the Norwegian colonies in eastern Quebec, mentioned earlier, were visited by pastors who were based in the US. So Bury, for example, was served by a minister based in Portland, Maine. And according to Loken, quote, some of these early American parishes were responsible for considerable movement of the early colonists into the US. The Norwegian migrants not only brought their attachments to the various Norwegian American synods with them, but they also brought the desire to establish religious schools and academies to prepare young people for teaching and preaching. 2 notable examples are Camrose Lutheran College, founded in 1910, and Outlook College in Saskatchewan, established in 1915. And today I'm going to limit my comments to CLC, as it was known. In what Loken calls the pioneering era, from 1912 to 1926, all of the presidents were Norwegian American pastors, the first being J.P. Tonberg, who was a graduate of St. Olaf College. In addition, all of the CLC teachers were American graduates of church colleges in the US. The aim of CLC's curriculum was to help students develop skills to succeed at American colleges and universities. By 1927, however, the teaching staff was entirely Canadian. So that was a quick transition, both in terms of citizenship and training. And their focus was to prepare students for the Canadian context. As with the churches, we see a transition from an American to a Canadian identity. And here you see the laying of the cornerstone for the main building, Founders Hall as it's called today. And you'll notice the bunads and of course the Norwegian flag there, along with the Canadian at the time flag. And the building was complete. So that was in 1911. School founded in 1910. Cornerstone, they held classes somewhere else. 1911, cornerstone was laid, and then in 1912 the building was completed. And in Old Main there, everything took place. This is a familiar story. The dorms, offices, cafeteria, and classes, all in that building. It was a very small group of students, of course. And here we have Founders Hall today. It was a historic site, or a historical, it had a designation as a historical building for a while, but it had to be renovated, so we lost that, but it's still a very valued building. And then you have an aerial view of our campus today. Has anybody been in Camrose in this crowd? Okay, yes, great. So let's look at a couple of specific locations, including Camrose. And this is a sign that's just outside of town. Alberta's History, Norwegian Settlement. You'll notice it's in both English and Norwegian. At the turn of the century, and in the first decades of the 20th century, many Norwegians came to areas within an 80-kilometer radius of what is today Camrose, and it was originally called Oslo and then Sparling. New Norway and Bergen are two aptly named towns in the area, and Camrose's position as a Norwegian-Canadian hub was strengthened by the establishment, of course, of CLC. This is just another shot from a picture from Loken's book of some early settlers. One of the earliest settlers in what is now Camrose was a Norwegian, Ole Bakken, who was born in Valdres in 1854. He emigrated to Minnesota with his family, and he moved up to Canada in 1894 as the Northwest Territories was opening up to settlers from many countries. Keep in mind that Alberta and Saskatchewan became provinces in 1905. According to legend, Bakken had a dream when he was in Norway that he would sail across the Atlantic and settle near a stream where a city would later be built. Now, this story can't be confirmed, but we have photographic and written evidence that Bakken built a house on the banks of the Stony Creek, and a replica stands today at the Camrose and District Centennial Museum. Bakken was famous for his homemade bread, smoked ham, and hospitality. And Camrose did become a village and then a town. Camrose was also the site of the Store Stevne, the Big Convention, in July of 1926. A 3-day event which drew thousands of Norwegian Canadians from across Canada. In addition to the individual bygdelag holding their own meetings, a joint gathering was held during which the League of Norsemen in Canada was officially organized. And here's a panorama shot, a photo of the event taken at the fairgrounds. This was a big event for a small town, and this picture is still hanging at the local Lefse House. And I'm going to get to that in a bit. The big gathering reflected the desire of many Norwegian Canadians to develop more direct ties with the home country than they were able to have via organizations in the States. The 1926 event grew out of a 1925 Norwegian migration centennial celebration held in Outlook, Saskatchewan. Oh, and here's another picture that I have to show you because I love skiing. This is our ski jump. It was recently, there were several ski jumps. Right now we don't have one, but ski jump events for our ski club, which was originally called Fram, or after Fridtjof Nansen, also drew thousands of spectators. Within the 80-kilometer radius of Camrose that I mentioned lies Bardo. And I want to mention it because the Norwegians who settled it were part of several intracontinental movements. As Odd Lovoll states in his article on the Bardo settlement in Minnesota History, quote, "This group's willingness to move demonstrates a continuous process of rural to rural migration and suggests how agricultural communities were created and transplanted within Norway itself and again across the North American continent in a multi-stage migration spanning several generations." And here's a picture from Bardo today. There are a few farmers around, but it isn't an actual settlement anymore, but this building still stands. So today Bardo, I'll tell you, Bardo, you'll notice the spelling here, B-A-R-D-O, and when the original settlers came, and I'm going to tell you about their movements, that's how it was spelled in Norway, but it is now Bardu with a U. So today Bardo, now called Bardu, is a municipality located in Troms in the north of Norway. So the group there was this group of people up there in Bardo, but the people that lived there in 1876 when they moved to North America. Their ancestors had come in 1791 from further south in Norway. So we have this movement from Tynset and Alvdal in the Østerdalen Valley. They moved up and settled this area in Troms. In 1876, a small group of Bardo residents moved to the Red River Valley of Minnesota to the Crookston area. As Alberta opened up for settlement in the 1890s, some of the original group moved up to central Alberta, founding the Bardo settlement in 1894. So we start out, of course, Norway, and then we go to the Red River Valley, up here to close to not so far from Edmonton. And then again, in 1911, a group of the settlers in Crookston in Bardo, Alberta, decided to go further north in Alberta to Valhalla. They founded Valhalla, about 40 kilometers from the BC border. It's just 60 kilometers northwest of Grand Prairie. There we go. So this is a better map, but they're getting close to BC. So they moved a lot, and it's a fascinating, fascinating story. This group included Lutheran pastor N.N. Ronning and his family, among them his son Chester Ronning. And Ronning has a Camrose connection in that he served as the principal of CLC in the late 1930s. He was also the choir director, but he's best known for his time as a Canadian diplomat and a politician. And you can read books about Chester Ronning. This is a chapter I don't have time to cover, but the Ronning family was involved in many intra- and intercontinental movements. They had transnational identities involving Europe, Asia, and North America. There is a fascinating local history of Bardo written by two local women, Ragna Stan and Magda Henriksson, called Pioneer Days in Bardo, which was published in 1944. And actually, Magda Henriksson, one of the authors, you see her here on your screen as a young girl. And this photo was submitted, I believe, by her mother. So this was in 1894. I actually referred to this local history in my Viking frame comments. I find this work to be valuable not only due to it being it's informed by oral history, but due to its inclusivity. It contains perspectives of locals, providing a balance of voices of men, women, and children, and the book is dedicated to the early pioneer mothers. In addition, Stan and Henriksson touch on Indigenous encounters, acknowledging the land upon which they had settled was previously inhabited by various First Nations and was still being inhabited by them when they started to live there, and recognizing the presence and at times assistance of Indigenous neighbors. Entire chapters are devoted to topics such as homemaking, the Bardo Ladies' Aid, pioneer mothers, and pioneer neighbors. While this history book is briefly referenced by, among others, Loken, Lovoll, and Christian Borgenheim in her MA thesis on Norwegian Canadian identity in Western Canada, it deserves a more thorough analysis. This local history provides rich material for further study through the lenses of gender, Indigenous, and children's studies. And in the near future, I'm planning on working with Pioneer Days in Bardo, as well as Magda Henriksson's novel and short stories, which I've recently discovered, focusing on her attempts to be inclusive, both in terms of gender and race. Borgenheim's MA thesis that I just mentioned, From Sod Hut to Lefse House, Immigration, Ethnicity, and the Formation and Reformulation of the Norwegian Canadian Identity in Western Canada, highlights both connections between Norwegian Canadians and Norwegian Americans in the early years, but also identifies ways in which settlers eventually worked to, quote, distance themselves from their countrymen in the States. And here's the Lefse House picture. This was taken this 17. Mai. There I am with the local Sons of Norway Lodge. I talked to them about crossings, and very good Lefse. So I've now commented on some of the key books and articles written about Norwegian migration to Canada. Loken's history isn't unproblematic with its filiopietistic bent, but it is the only comprehensive work on this topic. Perhaps it's time for another historian to take this on with fresh eyes and framing. And of course, many years have passed since that was published. Lovoll's valuable contributions focus on specific chapters in geographic areas, Bardo, Quebec, and this is also the approach of amateur historians like Foe and Stan and Hendrickson. In addition, I've pointed out material on Norwegian migration contained in larger works, which place this migration in a broader Scandinavian frame. Urberland's critical edition of a personal memoir is something I also covered, and critical editions of personal narratives, particularly those that employ multidisciplinary lenses and schools of thought, offer fresh perspectives. And I'm a literature person, so now I'm going to kind of move into that. A fine example is Eleanor Merrikin's Looking for Country, a Norwegian Immigrants' Alberta memoir, with an introduction focusing in part on gender by literary scholar Janice Dicken. Merrikin's story involves myriad geographical movements from Norway to the US, from the US back to Norway, and then on to Canada, and then back to the US. So there's all this movement. Personal narratives, particularly northern personal narratives, are one of my research interests. And when I previously encountered a published narrative by a Norwegian fur trader, Einar Odd Mortensen, who spent 3 years in northern Manitoba in the late 1920s, I recognized it needed some framing before it was published in English. As a result, I not only worked with the original text and compiler, Gerd Sjustad Mortensen, but also my colleague Daniel Sims, a professor of First Nations Studies and a Canadian historian. Our combined efforts have allowed us to contribute to literary, Indigenous, and Scandinavian studies, and we ended up with a result that couldn't have been accomplished by any one of us. Crossing disciplinary borders and collaboration with migration materials can be very fruitful. Though there has arguably been a dearth of scholarship, I was just talking with this about a colleague, there's been a dearth of scholarship in the area of Norwegian Canadian studies, there's actually more out there when one starts to dig. And there are many unstudied materials in archives. But the archives, there's different archives, of course, as we know, with archival work. And I've encouraged people that are interested in this area to always look for Canadian content when you're in an archive. I spent a month at the Norwegian Emigrant Museum right outside of Hamar in Norway a couple of years ago, looking at letters, brochures, private archives, and newspaper clippings. And I wrote a short report sort of summarizing what's there, materials linked to the Norwegian migrant experience in Canada. I think it's 6 pages long. I'd be happy to share that with anybody interested in the area. Okay, so I promised to bookend my talk with stories and images. So before I get to my final thoughts, I do want to provide you with another image and photo as my second bookend. And this is one I just recently became aware of. This is a photo of Ingvald Ulai Eriksson, the grandfather of Elsa Berit Eriksson, a former Norwegian ambassador to Canada. I met her in Camrose just last week while she was traveling around Alberta, researching her grandfather's years there. And she has given me permission to share a part of his story, and in doing so, I will be sharing her story as well. Elsa Berit Eriksson never knew her morfar, her mother's father, since he left, because he left Norway in 1924 before she was born. And the family's last letter from him was sent from Alberta in 1927, when he was working as a trapper. Elsa Berit told me, quote, "He has always been with me, even though we never knew what happened to him." This photo, and the reason for that, she had this photo as a girl, and it was in her nightstand drawer. And she said because he had done so much traveling, it inspired her, encouraged her to think about traveling outside of her home area and studying and moving about. And of course, she was in the diplomatic corps and has lived in many different countries. Eriksson has recently discovered that her grandfather was from a Sami family in Nordland, and she wasn't sure, because people did used to dress up, right, for photos, and she wasn't sure if this was, it was just kind of an appropriation thing, or if this was his actual, if he was Sami. But she's found out that he was from a Sami family, and she's connected with that family. As she has done some field work in Norway and Alberta, Eriksson has discovered the various identities her grandfather assumed during his life in Norway, as he moved about frequently. And then she's also realized that he shed some of these identities when he arrived in North America, and as he assumed, took on a new life. And he died at the age of 88, and she's just found his grave. So she's thinking about a book or a film, and she's going to be focusing on the theme of shifting identities in her work. That's very exciting. In recent years, I have had contact with other Norwegians who are also working with their personal family stories in Canada. So Jan Harald Thomassen is one of them. Thomassen has a background in journalism, and he spent some time in Alberta in 2023 researching his family story. His great-grandmother, a Kven, emigrated from Tornedal on the border of Finland and Sweden, emigrated from there to northern Norway in 1867. So this was an intracontinental movement, and the family eventually moved to central Alberta. Oldemor's Reise, great-grandmother's journey, is now available on the Norwegian Public Broadcasting site, and the version subtitled in English, The Journey, will have its North American premiere at the Film Festival on Sunday, so you can catch that. And finally, I will mention a third Norwegian who has recently explored the Canadian branch of his family, namely the critically acclaimed Norwegian author Edvard Hoem. Hoem's recent best-selling novels about Knut Hansen Nesje and his family, works of historical fiction inspired by Hoem's own family history, are set during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Norway, in Molde, in Dakota, and Alberta. Intracontinental movements play a central role in these works, and the first volume was translated into English and published here in 2022 with the title Haymaker in Heaven. Hopefully the others will eventually appear as well. So the novel's rich in Canadian content will be available to a broader audience. A number of people in Norway have actually contacted me after reading Hoem's novels, inquiring about the Camrose area and the Norwegian settlements there. And I was at a session yesterday, and two of the presenters, one a historian and one a literary scholar, discussed how they were motivated by family photos and artifacts to embark on research projects. So the examples, and these are my final thoughts, the examples I have just given of people engaging with photos and artifacts, films, the oral tradition, and fiction are a reminder that we shouldn't underestimate the power of fiction, oral stories, and the visual arts to inspire people to connect with history, including the Norwegian migration experience in Canada. Thanks.
We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I'm happy to bring the microphone around if anybody has any questions for Dr. Urberg.
I'm just going to put this up as a backdrop. Somebody from my oral history project. Okay.
Oh, thank you for your talk, Ingrid. That was very great. I happen to have a great uncle and aunt who went from southern Minnesota to Saskatchewan, I believe, around 1905 or 1903, 1908. Mm-hmm. Can you give me some insight on what was going on there that attracted them at that time?
Right. Well, can you 1905? You said they went.
Somewhere in
yeah. So that would have been just as Saskatchewan was becoming an official part of Canada. It became a province. Well, the land had opened up. There were incentives for folks. There was there was land for the take. You know, people were able to settle on land for a variety of reasons. Partly due to the development of the railroad, areas were being cleared. So that would have been an incentive, which started in the late 19th century. So land was opening up. There were government incentives for folks. The railway The railroads were sort of completed for the time being, and they allowed people to move more freely. But perhaps part of it was that there had been movement, in the late 19th century, so perhaps they knew people there from their home communities, and there was just what happened in the U.S., people settled from various parts of Norway. They wrote letters back home and encouraged family and friends to join them. There was a lot of that took place on the Prairie Provinces as well. So could be a combination of those circumstances. And the times were tough everywhere, but there were some difficult things that happened, in the Midwest in terms of drought and economic depression also that were sort of pushing them out. And then there were those pull factors as well. If you're interested in Saskatchewan, I'd really recommend Anderson's Settling Saskatchewan. It's extremely detailed, and you may even find, those areas, a discussion of the areas where your family settled. Yeah, thanks for that question.
So to what extent did Norwegian immigrants in Canada stay connected to or become more isolated from those in America? So they left America, went up to Canada, but did they, I guess I mean this in two different ways, so remain connected to or isolated from the communities that they left, so kind of a related question maybe. But then also with publications, newspapers, magazines, were they reading American ones there? Were there Canadian-specific ones? Just to what extent were the communities,
There were very, very close connections for a long time, actually. First of all, just those familial connections and the correspondence that went on, and even visits. I mean, people were able to visit each other. But they were closely connected, like I mentioned, the schools, and the teachers, the pastors, the church, but also publications. There were many, many people people that moved from the States to Canada who continued to subscribe to Decora Posten, for example. It had a huge, circulation, and that included Canada. And there were some Norwegian Canadian newspapers. There were like two that had a substantial life. One was Vancouver Posten. I think that was founded in 1931. But there was also a big one in Winnipeg, Norrøna, that was started in 1910 maybe. And they contained information, they reprinted things. They also had information from the States. But one of the reasons they wanted to start having their own newspapers is that they felt that they were sometimes marginalized in the Norwegian American press. There was a bit of that. I mean, you saw that with the schools, with the big Bygdelag wanting to establish a relationship directly with Norway. You're little and they're bigger. This still happens today. But so I'd say there was very good communication and connections, but there was, as the years went on, that desire to establish their distinct identity. But that didn't mean they cut off ties or anything like that. It was like a family in a way, I think. I mean, today really, even with Sons of Norway, there's still, like with the heritage groups, there still is this really close connection. But even with things like NAHA, Norwegian American Historical Association, I mean, that's kind of making that, I'm sort of going on a side path, but there is this effort for people interested in the Norwegian migrant experience to gather and look at it collectively, and I think partly due to all those connections, and we're neighbors. And did I answer your question? Yeah. I know, and there's people here that know, I'm sure, much more about some of these issues, so if anyone else wants to contribute, you are welcome.
If you have comments, feel free to raise your hand.
First, thank you for the presentation on the Canadian side of it, because even though my family's in southern Minnesota, there's a story of, a uncle basically that went to Canada, and I've always wondered about why, and especially the time period being in, the early 1900s. But my question actually is regarding to one of the photographs that you took, and if you could go back, it's the photo of, not that one, a log house.
Oh, the Ulebakken?
Not that one, but
no.
this one.
This one?
Yep.
Okay.
So this is really interesting to me because I study buildings, and this log construction house is very similar to what you'd find in Norway. Mm-hmm. And it's actually pretty rare to find log construction houses that have those elements.
Oh, interesting.
And most of my research has been in southern Minnesota. But this is probably the only photograph I've seen of a log house that has distinct Norwegian elements in the log form. And I was wondering, if you have any information about, especially because it's from 1894, if that's what you said, that's really late. And could you shed any light on perhaps why they may have kept, that kind of tie, or just fill out any information if you don't know about the building?
Well, that is an excellent, excellent question, and is completely outside of my area of expertise. But that's very interesting to me, and I so appreciate that comment. Wow, I had no idea. I guess these people would have, they were the Bardo folks. So my guess would be is that they carried that knowledge with them from northern Norway to Minnesota and then up again. Now, some of the people in Bardo did, a lot of them came up from Crookston, but also there was direct migration from Bardo itself. So who knows, maybe it was someone that had come over, although this was 1894, you see. So they would have been via Crookston, but these were people that generally had also, the adults would have come directly from Norway. So that is fascinating. Thank you for that comment. Yeah. And I'll be happy to, we can connect about getting this image. Okay.
I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. Thank you. Can you tell us a little more about the work you're doing on oral history? You had a slide at the end. Perhaps that's your subject?
Yes. Yeah, so most of my work in recent years has been on personal narratives, as I mentioned, but I do have this oral history project on the go, and I need to get it out there. I'm going to be donating eventually the actual interviews to NAHA archives, so they'll be there. But I started this project long ago, and I interviewed over 30 people who emigrated directly from Norway to Canada and ended up in Alberta before 1970, I think I said that. So most of the people at the time that I was interviewing were very elderly, and many of them have passed. And so I didn't talk about it today because I'm talking about the Intracontinental, and these were the people that came directly and some a bit later. So I am working on issues of identity and place in these stories that they shared with me. I have these, of course, recorded. I have published an article based on the notion of friluftsliv in these narratives, but I hope to produce something that's longer. And I appreciate the question. So it's a very exciting project. I love story, as we all do, and this project was inspired by Ingeborg Haugen, and I'll just, if you allow me, just tell you a little bit about her, because her story is so fascinating. I met her when she was 102 years old in Camrose, and someone put me in touch with her. She was in a care facility. She was she wasn't living on her own, but she was, I think, 99 when she moved out of her house, and she came from Setesdal and had grown up in a quite isolated part of Norway. And she had for example, the Spanish flu and almost died from it, but she lived to be 107. She worked as a domestic, as a sort of in charge of the household for a very rich shipping family in Arendal. And she was so loyal to the family she'd worked for, she wouldn't tell me their name. And I haven't tried to dig because I think she didn't want to tell me, but royalty would come to the door and she let them in. Anyway, she had all modern amenities there. And then she got a letter from a childhood friend in Camrose area, and he had lost his wife. She died. He had a young son, and he said, "I'm desperate. I need help. Would you marry me? Would you come to Canada?" And so this is Ingeborg. She was an adventuresome person. She didn't know a word of English. She left in 1939 after the war had broken out in Europe. Made it to Camrose. They got married that day. She went out to the country. No electricity. Settlement happened a lot later. No electricity, no water. Had to learn to drive a tractor. And she lived there for 25 years with her husband. He died. She said, "I'm going back to Norway." And she went back and it had changed too much. So she came back to Canada. But she told me before she died, she said, Ingrid, you are not going to understand me unless you visit the Seter in Valle, in Setesdal. So I went there after she had passed. And I just went around knocking on doors in this tiny place and met someone who remembered her when she'd come back in the 60s. And she said, I'm going to, now you, and Ingeborg took 9 hours or something to walk up there when she was 90 the last time. They didn't have the roads, but there was a road. So I got driven up to the Seter and got to visit it. So that's just one of my stories about Ingeborg. But they were amazing, generous people who often said to me, I'll tell you my story, but I don't think, it's anything. And of course, yes. Yeah.
We know that our grandfather around the turn of the century went up, we think, Alberta to drive a steam plow. Do you could you help me understand what the circumstances might have been?
What year did you say?
Well, right, 1908, 1910 perhaps?
Well, I guess similar to the other question, I mean, I don't know a lot about like farming or equipment or anything like that, but I assume it, and perhaps invited by someone that he knew they needed his, I mean, it was a time when a lot of people moved for many reasons, but often because they knew people or were invited, there were lots of jobs, yeah?
Would it have been for individual farmers or
I see.
companies or? Because he didn't take the plow up there, I'm sure.
Okay, that's a good question. I will have to kind of look into that one, but thank you for the question, yeah.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I really was looking forward to being here because I do have relatives who live in Canada, and I hadn't connected with them for a long, long time, and now I'm reconnected with them, so it's very exciting. But they're in Manitoba. Do you have any particular comments about Norwegians going from, for example, Minnesota to the Manitoba?
They did do that, and of course that Norwegian language newspaper was founded in Winnipeg. As we know, Manitoba is much better known for the Icelandic settlements and Gimli and so on. But they went there. If you look at Loken, for example, he does have a fair bit of information about Manitoba, although I think he sort of privileges Alberta and Saskatchewan as well. But I mean, nothing specific. They went a bit earlier, I think. I don't know. They probably went about the same time. I don't have anything more to tell you, but I can direct you to some resources on that area. Yeah, and when Canadians think of Manitoba, they think of Icelandic stuff, right? But there were absolutely other Scandinavians there as well.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions.
This is just a quick one. Can you flash your sources slide
Sure.
up so we can take a photo?
Of course.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'm happy to share that with you also. Anybody, I can send it to you if you want it. I'll leave that up, okay? And I guess there's one more.
Thank you for this session. I wondered if you could answer, given our opening presentation about the interactions between the Indigenous and immigrant communities, I read with pleasure your fur trader text that you helped translate. You mentioned it. I don't know if you want to scan back to that. And I wondered if you could just speak briefly to connect some of that's an interesting migration story because he leaves, right? He comes, Norwegian comes to Manitoba and goes back home to Norway. But I wondered if you might comment briefly on or comment further on some of the interactions with First Nation peoples through that lens and connects with some of your oral storytelling.
Yeah, my oral stories, people did not talk a lot about their interactions with Indigenous people, and they were a little bit later. But I think the important points are when the people came in the late 19th, early 20th century, of course, these treaties had been signed, but there were many Indigenous people in the area, and there still are, and there were interactions between them. And a lot of there's not a lot of information about it in terms of our sources, but we do know that people were neighbors from different ethnicities and different backgrounds, Indigenous backgrounds, non-Indigenous backgrounds, and I think that's why this Pioneer Days in Bardo is a super valuable source because it's recognized that, we came to a place and there were other people here, and they talk about people being moved off and about some of the tensions, and also about, the helpfulness that was there. Because I think there's often this tendency to focus on the conflict, but people helped each other out. Like a woman broke her leg, and there was a neighbor, an indigenous neighbor, that came over and stayed with her and helped her, nurse her through that experience. But and I'm trying to think of which of these sources covers it. Maybe it's Lovoll. At any rate, no, it's American maybe. But as more and more settlers came, tensions increased, of course. In the early days, I think there wasn't so much tension because there was more space and people continued to be pushed, but I think the tensions sort of increased maybe with time. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think there's some valuable stuff out there. The Mortensen text that you mentioned, I guess in response to Manitoba, there are all these there are some fur trader accounts and wilderness accounts, and that's kind of a whole another area. But I just find it fascinating that in 1944, Magda Hendrickson was writing about Indigenous settler relationships and tensions and positive interactions as well. So it's not like it's not exoticized anything. It's not exoticizing things, but it's not idealizing, but it's not catastrophizing it either. It's a very kind of nuanced approach, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Urberg.
Let's see, where's this? Turn this off.